Okay, so let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a really challenging but honestly fascinating topic, the science that suggests you might not be as free as you think. We're diving into what's called determinism, this idea that every single choice you make is, well, the inevitable result of a chain of events that started long, long before you were even a thought. You know, we all have this incredibly strong feeling, right? This intuition that we're the ones writing our own story. I mean, from what you chose for breakfast this morning to huge life-altering decisions, it feels like we are in the driver's seat. But what if that feeling of control isn't real? What if it's all just a very convincing illusion? Okay, to really get to the bottom of this, let's try a little thought experiment. Just imagine for a second, you have a gun, and you have to make a choice. You're about to see a list of possible targets, everything from a terrorist to, yeah, even an infant Hitler. The decision of who to shoot, or if you should shoot at all, it's going to feel like it's 100% yours and yours alone. Every single one of these options feels like a separate, monumental decision, doesn't it? A moral calculation that you are making. You could be the hero, the villain, the merciful one. You could even try to save the world, or you could just walk away. It feels like your choice. But here's the big question. What if that powerful feeling of making a choice is just the very last ripple in a pond, caused by a stone thrown long, long ago, an invisible chain of events stretching way back in time? All right, so let's do exactly that. Let's rewind. We're going to zoom out from that exact moment of decision and travel backwards in time. We're going to uncover all the hidden forces that were already shaping your choice, way before you even knew a choice was on the table. So here's our roadmap for this journey back in time. We're going to start just 1 second before the trigger is pulled and then work our way backward, step by step. Think of it like peeling an onion, layer by layer. We'll go from immediate brain chemistry all the way back to the ancient history that literally built the brain that's doing the choosing. Okay, first stop, 1 second before you act. Your prefrontal cortex, or PFC, is firing on all cylinders. You can think of it as the CEO of your brain, right? The part that makes the big executive calls. But here's the thing. This CEO's judgment, it can get seriously clouded. It's getting bombarded with these urgent messages from neurotransmitters, like dopamine, basically screaming about how good a certain reward or outcome will feel. And that just completely biases the scales of what we'd call a rational decision. So here's the real kicker. Your brain in that critical moment, it is not a blank slate, not even close. Its condition is a product of everything happening right now, how stressed you are, how tired you are, but also long-term stuff, like a previous head injury or the constant state of high alert that can come from a lifetime of discrimination. And the most important part, you didn't choose any of it. Now let's zoom out a bit more to the hours and days leading up to the choice. Your hormones have been busy setting the stage. For example, testosterone. It doesn't just create aggression from nothing. It's more like an amplifier. It takes aggressive tendencies that are already there and just turns up the volume. And on the flip side, you've got hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin, which can push you towards being more social, more bonded. They can even make a rodent that's normally polygamous suddenly become monogamous. So these invisible hormonal tides are constantly shifting the odds of what you're going to choose. Okay, now we're going way back, years, even decades. We're talking about the time that literally sculpted the physical structure of your brain. Your childhood, your upbringing, that wasn't just a background setting for your life. It was the actual architect, laying down the wiring in your head. And if you're wondering just how deep this rabbit hole goes, get this. By the time a baby is just 4 weeks old, its family's socioeconomic status can already predict things about the physical structure of its prefrontal cortex. That's insane. So the luck of the draw, where you were born, who you were born to, it's not some minor detail. It's a foundational piece of the puzzle, shaping the very tool you use to make choices, right from the very beginning of your life. And that brings us to the final, deepest layer. We've hit bedrock. This is the stuff that was in place before you even existed. The specific genes passed down through countless generations. And the culture, the whole set of rules and values you were dropped into. I love this quote from Robert Sapolsky because it just nails the modern view of genetics. See, we used to think of genes as these little puppet masters pulling our strings, but that's not right. They're much more like recipes in a giant cookbook. The recipes are there, they have the instructions, but it's the environment, the chef, if you will, that decides which recipe to cook and when. Things like your stress levels or your culture, they determine which genetic recipes get used, creating tendencies, not destiny. Okay, so a really common pushback you hear at this point is, hold on, the world is just way too messy, too complex, and unpredictable for everything to be predetermined. And that's a fair point, but it kind of mixes up two very, very different ideas, being unpredictable and being uncaused. So before we unpack that, let's just make sure we're on the same page about what determinism actually means here. It's a pretty simple but powerful idea. Everything happens for a reason. There's an unbroken chain of cause and effect. Nothing just happens out of the blue. It's always the result of something that came before it. And this is where that key distinction comes in. Think about the weather. It's a perfect example of a chaotic system. It follows the laws of physics, deterministically down to the last molecule, but it is so unbelievably complex that we can't predict it with 100% accuracy more than a few days out. So the weather is unpredictable, but it's not undetermined. See the difference? Unpredictable just means we don't have enough information. Undetermined would mean it's happening for no reason at all, which would break the laws of physics. And all the amazing complexity we see in the world and in ourselves, it doesn't actually need a grand designer or some magical, uncaused free choice to exist. It can all emerge from very simple deterministic rules. It's like that quote says, you can get a magnificent palace just from the interactions of zillions of identical bricks, no blueprint needed. In the same way, our incredibly complex behaviors can arise from a simple but very long history of cause and effect. All right, so this is where it gets a little scary for a lot of people. It's the big "so what" question. If everything we do is just the inevitable result of biology and history, then what's to stop us all from just running amok? If nobody is really responsible for their actions, why not just go wild? Well, it's interesting because when you actually look at the real world, the data seems to point in the opposite direction. If you look at highly secular societies, say in Scandinavia, they often have a really high quality of life and pretty low rates of crime and violence, especially when compared to a highly religious society like the United States. Now, this doesn't prove one causes the other, of course, but it does suggest that you don't necessarily need a belief in some kind of cosmic judge to have a safe, functional society. And this whole idea could lead to a really radical shift in how we think about something like justice. We could move away from our current model, which is mostly about retribution, about blame, and making people pay for what they did. Instead, we could move towards something more like a public health model. And the quarantine analogy is perfect here. We don't blame someone for having a contagious disease, right? But we absolutely take steps to quarantine them to protect everyone else. In the same way, you can manage people who are dangerous without needing the idea of blame or that they freely chose to be that way. And you know what? This isn't some new, crazy idea. We've done this before, over and over again. As our scientific knowledge grows, our circle of compassion tends to get wider. I mean, think about it. People with epilepsy used to be seen as demonically possessed, as if it were their fault. Now, we understand it's a neurological condition, and the blame is completely gone. It seems like the arc of human knowledge always bends away from blame and towards understanding. But let's be real for a second. It's one thing to accept all this stuff with your brain intellectually. It's another thing entirely to actually live it, to feel it in your gut, and that is incredibly hard. In fact, it's a huge challenge even for the scientists who study this stuff for a living. Robert Sapolsky, the neuroscientist whose work is a huge part of this, tells this incredibly honest story about his own struggle. He said that even with everything he knows, his gut reaction to hearing about a horrific crime was that he wanted to see the face of evil, not the face of an unfortunate product of biology and environment, but evil. It just goes to show how deep our instincts for blame really run. And that gut reaction is powerful, there's no denying it, but the science pushes us toward a different and maybe harder conclusion. And it's really important to get this right. This is not about making excuses for horrible behavior. It's about finding an explanation for it. It forces us to look at the person who overcomes incredible adversity and the person who squanders every opportunity and see them as two sides of the same coin. Both are the products of a long history that they had no hand in writing. At the end of the day, we are all just the sum of everything that came before us. But this knowledge, it doesn't have to be depressing or paralyzing. Actually, it can be the opposite. Understanding the forces that shape us is the first step toward consciously changing those forces. It shows us that if we want to change, just trying harder might not be enough. We have to change our environments, our inputs. But maybe the biggest takeaway is what this means for how we treat each other. Because if our actions are really just the final page of a chapter that began long, long ago, then it leaves us with a really big question, doesn't it? How do we decide together what the next chapter for all of us is going to look like?